Thank you all so much for being here today. Let me first start off by seeing if we can come to some degree of consensus of what actually constitutes these endless wars. I think many would agree that yes, in Afghanistan, that is the case. But is that also the case in Syria? Is it the case in Iraq? Is it the fact that we have troops there in and of itself enough to constitute an endless war? Is it the fact that our mission in Syria seems to be changing every time the president speaks, whether it is to defeat ISIS or now to counter Iran, to now steal the oil? Is that what makes these endless wars? Can we come to a consensus? I'm going to start off with Tom.
Thank you. It's great to be here. So, I don't really like the label, I think, because I think we need to disaggregate between them. I think that I get the sort of sentiment, and I think there's an important sort of point there. My position is I favor ending the war in Afghanistan. I think the U.S. should keep a small troop presence in Syria and Iraq because I think counterterrorism is an important mission there. I don't really see how you can prevent the re-rise of ISIS by fully withdrawing troops. I would end support for the Saudi war in Yemen. Where else am I forgetting? But I think that's sort of the major conflicts. Just to make one slightly broader point, I thought when Obama escalated in Afghanistan and withdrew troops from Iraq, he was sort of aggregating sort of the conflicts together in terms of, Afghanistan was the just war and Iraq was the unjust war, and therefore you should continue in Afghanistan and withdraw from Iraq. And the strategic importance of both of those was sort of disconnected from the origin of each, right? I think there was a case for keeping some troop presence in Iraq and actually pulling out of Afghanistan, even though one was unjust and one was just. So I think we ought to have the strategic debate on each case. I would worry about mission creep. I would share, I think there is something of a consensus on Afghanistan, but I think we'd probably differ in terms of how far we would go and whether or not we would lump all of those conflicts together.
Very interesting. Rosa, would you agree, though, that if we have troops staying in Syria and Iraq for counterterrorism, that would be just a counterterrorism operation? It would not constitute an endless war?
It would depend. I'm a lawyer, but in fact, I want to agree with Tom. I think war is a phrase that in some ways we probably should retire because it is so slippery and is deployed to mean so many things that it has become much more obfuscating than clarifying. And indeed, we've seen governments, including obviously our own, deploy it at times to evade forms of legal and political accountability by saying, because this is a war issue, an armed conflict issue, therefore it would be inappropriate to have certain forms of judicial review. At other times, equally, for instance, in the context for the Obama administration of military action in Libya, to deploy it in the opposite direction, to say, well, we don't have to seek report to Congress or seek authorization under the War Powers Act because this isn't a war. We're just using airplanes and drones to drop bombs on people. So I think that Tom is absolutely right when he says the issue is to disaggregate and be quite clear what it is that we are talking about. And the term war does not help us there at all. I think counterterrorism too, that if we're not going to be specific, that could mean anything from large-scale ground combat involving thousands of troops to just a advise, train, assist role with a tiny number of troops. And those are quite different, and the stakes for the United States are different. The consequences for the countries that we're in are different. The consequences for allies and adversaries are different. And if we can't be really clear on what it is that we mean when we say a counterterrorism issue or counterterrorism presence, we haven't advanced the ball at all.
Emma and Stephen, there is a growing sentiment both on the left and on the right, generally against this period. Whether it is to have a smaller number of troops in these countries, whether we call it war, whether we call it counterinsurgency, they don't go into the details of that. There is a sentiment that this is not what they want. How would you define it, both of you?
So I would be concerned about abandoning the notion of war. It's clear that in practice, the distinction between war and peace has blurred. But if we say that there's no such thing as war, there's also no such thing as peace. And I don't want that to be the case. I think the United States can live at peace with the world and should in the 21st century, which is free of colonial empires and free of the Cold War, unless we want to turn into an empire, unless we want to start Cold Wars or hot wars with other countries. So, for me, I think we should listen. I get the point about disaggregating among the different policy options in specific places when we make policy, and that's true. But I think we should listen to what the American people are saying when they describe their number one grievance with American foreign policy in terms of endless war. I'm a historian by training, and that's not something common in American history. In fact, the phrase itself is of pretty recent origin in widespread usage. And I think they're not just saying that the war in Afghanistan has gone on for a long time, or the war on terror itself keeps dragging on. That is true. And I think they're also not just saying that they don't know when these conflicts will come to an end, but they're saying there's a lack of purpose. So it's end in that sense. What are we there for? What interests are we advancing? Are we making things better or worse? And so I think ultimately I would take a very expansive view of what endless war means to me, and I think what's being expressed by the public and by some politicians when they talk about ending endless war. We should move away from a situation where, the world is free and sovereign unless we have a problem, and then the United States thinks about invading that country, trying to change the regime of that country, not recognize forces that are in power. There's an imperiousness and a detachment from interests of the American people that are recognizable to our public that I think is being expressed in this phrase. And so I think it's an invitation for us all to really think with that and understand how, in the broadest sense, do we want the United States to relate to the world in the 21st century.
I mean, if I could twist the question a little bit, you're sitting at Cato, and at Cato you have been arguing, the Cato Institute itself has been arguing for a very long time against this expansionist foreign policy. It must feel as if the rest of the world is catching up to you, at least Washington is catching up to you these days, as some of these thoughts are becoming more mainstream and more popular. From where you stand, how predictable was this? And do you see this as just being a consequence of the policies that we've been pursuing, and that this was something that should have been foreseen, could have been foreseen, was foreseen by you, and what's the solution to it?
Well, I hope that's not a comment on how I look, because I have not been arguing for this at Cato for that long, just a few years. But you're right, my colleagues at Cato, many of them have been making this argument for many years. If you go back and you look at the arguments made by people like Ted Carpenter, Chris Preble, they were making those arguments shortly after the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, that this could get out of control and was likely to get out of control. And I think what we have seen since that time is this real blurring of the lines, as Rosa noted, between sort of war and peace. There's a lot of things that we could categorize as war. There's very little that we could categorize as peace in U.S. foreign policy today. But the public, I don't think, necessarily interprets, say, a drone strike somewhere as being at war. So from the point of view of talking to the public about this, I think it's perhaps less useful to use the phrase war and more useful to talk about where are we in conflict? Where are U.S. forces engaged in fighting? And a couple of years back, I did an experiment because I just got very frustrated with congressional hearings about the use of military force. And so I asked a bunch of interns, help me out here, go out, tell me how many countries the U.S. is involved in conflict in. And across a group of about 10 interns, I got answers that ranged from 3 countries to 9 countries. And this was before Syria, so we're heading up towards 10 or 11 at this point. And that was because they just couldn't decide. Did it have to be a declared war? Did it have to be a war with hostilities on both sides? Did it need boots on the ground? The point, however, was that there was a very large set of cases for them to look at where US troops are involved in everything from train and equip to train and equip that turns into little missions on the ground, helping other forces, to drone strikes, to actual large-scale military campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this is all part of the post-war on terror approach to foreign policy. And so I do think that the word war is not particularly useful in this context, but we do need to have a very broad and expansive view of how we're considering conflict.
Tom, you and Stephen had two very interesting articles in the current issue of Foreign Affairs. You ferociously argue against what you call retrenchment.
Ferociously.
Yes. And you throw out a lot of very interesting arguments. One argument that stood out to me was that you were arguing that if the United States actually were to pull back and did not dominate every corner of the globe militarily and compelled some of these allies to shoulder a little bit more of that security burden themselves, that actually would lead to an intensification of right-wing populism and nationalism in Europe. My question to you is, the right-wing populism that we're seeing in Europe right now and the xenophobia that has come with it, is that actually not more of a result of the US pursuing the opposite? All of these different interventions in the Middle East that have seen these flows of refugees going into Europe, which then has been capitalized by some people to push for a much more xenophobic policy internally. Isn't it the other way around?
Well, no, thanks. Great question. Just one point on the Middle East before I get to your question. I mean, I think, when we talk about the public sort of view of this, I think if you do put a question at endless war, they will say they're against that. But the polls also show that they do care about terrorism, not just in the United States, in Europe, and in with the rise of ISIS in the first place, public opinion, just as an analytical matter, went very quickly from being completely supportive of the withdrawal, basically, to wanting massive force right back in the region, right? And so I think if we talk about sort of that public opinion barometer, and I'm not saying that justifies necessarily one foreign policy or another, but it is a little bit contradictory. I mean, you get the desire to disengage, and you also really have genuine fear of ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever it is, and that, of course, is exacerbated by beheadings or attacks on concerts, and if they were to happen here, overnight you would go to having overwhelming congressional support. So I think these are really difficult dilemmas. I'm not sure that, they're solved by looking at congressional authorization. I mean, that's certainly a break on maybe the Trump administration, but that will change overnight in the case of certain contingencies. On your question, I mean, I think the populist sort of that populist right in particular has risen primarily because of the financial crisis. I mean, I think it wouldn't really exist in Europe if it wasn't for the financial crisis and the threats on the sort of center and the sense that the center has been discredited in Europe, and one can debate that one way or the other. Some of it's populist left in countries like Greece and in Spain and others. There is this far-right element, obviously, in Germany and France and Eastern and Central Europe. I think the refugee crisis did exacerbate it. I mean, we can debate whether or not that was U.S. policy. I think the war in Syria, seems to me a little bit disconnected, but I'm not totally sure we want to go down that sort of, rabbit hole of an argument about why that was sort of caused. But there's no question, I think, that it did sort of exacerbate that. I don't think it was the war in Iraq that did it as bad as that was. But the point I was trying to make in the article is that given where we are, right, if the U.S. was to, for instance, effectively pull out of NATO, whether formally or just practically, the people who benefit from that are not going to be, say, in France, like internationalists like Macron, who will say we all need to work together, right, to try to have a common European position, and that all the barriers that existed to that will go away. The beneficiaries of that will be Le Pen, right? It will be AfD. It will be those who say we are on our own. The Americans are not here anymore. We have to work with the Russians more, and they'll blame, foreigners, particularly from North Africa and the Middle East. And that's sort of what I was trying to get at. I think it's not that by disengaging we will empower the multilateralists. And when you talk to European officials and centrist politicians, they're sort of terrified of this. I mean, the reason they are engaging with Trump, right, is not because they like him. They do not like him at all. It's because they are terrified of him and they believe they have no options. They don't believe there's sort of an independent EU option post an American-led Europe.
Stephen, Emma, Rosa, would you want to jump in on this, specifically on, because so much of whether the U.S. were to pull back has been focused on what kind of instability may come, or some make that argument, others make the opposite argument. But when it comes to the internal political processes in some of those regions, would you agree with Tom?
Well, I just have a general reaction is that the answer that is often given, and I think Tom in a couple of ways displayed this, is it would be great if the United States could pull back militarily from the world, but there's this one thing, we got to fight terrorism, and the public will really demand it. Okay, it'd be great if we could pull back from Europe, but shoot, there's this upsurge of right-wing populism, and that will, in the short term, possibly benefit the wrong people in Europe. I think we need some longer-term, more strategic thinking. Now, I think if the United States, it's true that as long as terrorists are killing Americans and threatening to kill Americans, the public will be upset about that, and they should be. I'm upset about that. So in the long term, what we ought to do is stop killing so many people in the greater Middle East, and I think that the problem will diminish quite substantially. So it's a genuine problem, but I think that's the long-term vision. And likewise, when it comes to the possibility of retrenchment in Europe, this is something we should have done in the 1990s. And we should have done it across the board in the 1990s, and we're paying the price for having not done so and not debated this option more. And I think a lot of people agree with that, even if they say, well, now it's too late. But the whole promise of the unipolar moment and the adoption of armed primacy as the, if you will, grand strategy or the axiomatic policy of the United States in the 1990s was that, first of all, it was going to prevent the rise of major competitors to the United States. And now we see great powers like China rising and Russia asserting itself, and we're told, that means we've got to get really tough with them. They're threatening our position of primacy. Well, wait a minute. The argument for primacy was supposed to be precisely that we wouldn't be in a situation like this. So we've got to think really carefully about why that's happened. And so I think it's entered us into a downward spiral where the profligate deployment of American troops all around the world on the promise of peace through strength has not brought peace. Instead, it's brought endless war, at least in the Middle East, and we'll see if it expands from there. And it has made us weaker and created enemies over time. And so we should really be working to break that downward spiral. Doesn't mean we should just willy-nilly pull back, immediately everywhere. Of course not. And I think we will actually find partners in Europe who understand that the United States is not what they thought it was. It's not the United States of the mid-20th century. There's, I think, a real understanding and I think a willingness to work. I think actually the government of France would be a potential partner in this. And so one of the things that primacy has caused the United States to do is suppress the assertion of a strong Europe that actually cooperates on security and takes responsibility for security. And so that's something I actually support. So I think I'm pro-ally in that sense, but I think the United States has to try to stop suppressing the initiative of others, including its allies in the world, if it's going to have any hope at any point of pulling back before we have something, even a greater crisis that we have to contend with.
I mean, to bring it back a little sort of away from Europe, back to the Middle East, back to the question of wars, I think we should be clear that the domestic politics of some of the countries in which we have large number of troops is probably going to get worse when we pull those troops out. Afghanistan, I think, is perhaps the most obvious example before us, but it's not clear to me that that's a good enough reason to stay, which is one reason why I favor pulling back the vast majority of our troops from Afghanistan. It's why I favor pulling back most of our troops that are in conflict situations in the Middle East. And I think we should think about this much as economists think about economic reform, which is that things might get a little worse in the short run. And it's about having the political will and the messaging to push through that and see that in the long run, things may get better, should hopefully get better in the long run. And one reason why I'm not a huge fan of the ending endless wars language is I think the most important thing is perhaps not even ending the conflicts we're in today, it's avoiding getting in them in the future. Because this entire argument is basically about how once you're in, it's really, really hard to get out because things will get worse. If we resist that temptation to go into places in the first place, everybody's job gets easier.
Yeah, and going back to linking this back again to the initial question as Emma did, one of the reasons that I'm not a big fan of the endless war or the value of the term war is that I think it can mean so many different things, so many different people, that you can have the appearance of agreement, but in fact the reality of substantial disagreement. So if we define, ending endless war at a level of generality that's very high, that means let's not have pointless entanglements that kill Americans, kill other people, cost a lot of money, and have no obvious value to anyone, very few people are going to stand up and say, oh, no, wait, I want to defend that, except possibly people in this city, because it's full employment, right, for many people in the Washington establishment. But most Americans are going to say, yeah, that doesn't seem like such a hot idea to me. When you then drill down further and start saying, well, are you saying that you don't want this? Are you saying you don't want that? There's a great deal of disagreement. So I tend to just want us to have some specificity in the terms that we're using. And part of, I think that the challenge, I don't know what would happen in Europe if the US pulled back much more substantially. I don't think any of us know. And I think Emma's quite right to say that we shouldn't automatically assume that just because, but things might get worse, that that's a reason to stay. There are costs associated with whatever we do. There are unknowns associated with whatever we do. If we always forget when we talk about the sort of various just war principles, including when we talk about the so-called responsibility to protect framework, that a crucial piece of it that always gets lost in the conversation is not just, is something bad happening, could we do something, but are we persuaded that the something is actually going to make matters better rather than worse? Because if the answer to that is no, then there are terrible things that we can't do anything about. And we tend to lose sight of that in the conversation. I think that the challenge, and I don't have the faintest idea how to do this. So it's a challenge for all of us collectively. Is how do you start that much more robust national conversation that does have to have a lot of specificity? What are we doing? What do we want our role in the world to be? What types of engagements, where do we think are justified, for what reasons? What costs are we willing to incur? What risks are we willing to incur? And to have that conversation in a way that is broken down much more, I think it's very, very hard to do, in part because a lot of people just don't want to have the conversation. They're busy, they're preoccupied with all kinds of other things that to them feel much more urgent, and in a day-to-day sense are much more urgent to them. And this has become something that is far away. It's easier to fall back on the cliches, but there's not much for us to do with those cliches.
So let's have that cost conversation. I'm going to throw it to you, Tom. I know you wanted to say something else as well, but if you could answer this as well. Usually when anyone comes and argues for some form of a change of policy, the first question that is asked, well, how are you going to pay for it? This time, I think the question is more adequately asked of those who want to sustain the status quo. If you don't want to leave some of these regions, how are you going to pay for it? Mindful of the fact that there is a growing consensus that this is not sustainable.
I'm not sure there is a growing consensus on that, but we come back to that in a second. I mean, the point I just wanted to make was my view in the Middle East is it would be good to get out of the military conflicts if it were not for the terrorism problem, right? That is not my view of Europe or Asia, right? The argument about right-wing extremism is one of sort of 6 or 7 reasons, I offered, I think, not the only one. And the overarching reason is that the United States has had an interest for a long time in flourishing sort of open and prosperous and democratic societies. And that is actually the case in East Asia, by and large, and democratic East Asia. And it's the case pretty much in Europe, with some issues in Hungary and in Poland and elsewhere. But by and large, that's the case there. They're both working, from my point of view, perfectly fine. In Europe, it really doesn't cost all that much at all, because the troops that are there are actually cheaper to maintain there than they would be here, unless you want to cut them entirely, which is an argument we can have. But it's definitely sort of economically sustainable. I think there are real concerns if you were to withdraw about what would happen with Russia and the Baltics, for instance, if the U.S. guarantee wasn't there, if the NATO hadn't expanded. I mean, one could argue that they will be zones of conflict today. So I think there is a case for sort of maintaining sort of the status quo in those 2 regions, because it does pretty much actually work. And I guess the question I would have for Stephen is, would you say that the allies sort of get a say in this, right? I mean, the U.S. position, with the exception of Trump's ridiculous comment in Iraq, right, is, that if a country wants the U.S. troops to leave, the U.S. will leave, right? And that's definitely the case in Europe and Asia. They actually want the United States to stay. Even France wants the United States to stay. So what has been proposed on the retrenchment side is a unilateral move over the objections of democratic allies for something that they believe will be disastrous for their countries and their regions. Now, if you want to say that you would only do this, right, in full consultation, I'd be fine with that, because that's never going to happen, right? Because they're never going to say that that's what they want. But I mean, I think the argument that we're having is that there are people in the U.S. who believe that this is not serving America's interests and the U.S. ought to get out, and the rest of the world has to accommodate to that. And if things go badly, then things go badly, but that's basically their business. And the U.S. can use diplomacy and development and economics and all sorts of other things, but it's not going to use the military tool. I think that's the debate, so I don't know, I don't want to mischaracterize it, and please correct me if I am, but I think that's sort of the meta difference that we basically have. I'm not trying to dodge your question, sorry, but I've actually forgotten it.
That is to dodge it.
Right.
Well, actually, Stephen, why don't you answer the question that Tom posed then?
Sure. Well, I just want to comment. The United States year after year spends more than 50% of its federal discretionary budget going straight to the Defense Department, and then its slush fund as well. And if our concern is that we could have a rising China that would become increasingly aggressive, which is a concern, then any hope of reducing our defense budget, if we are aiming to defend, we have formal obligations to defend a third of the countries on Earth, and informal arrangements to defend dozens more. We have divided the world already before even the emergence of a serious rival into allies that we are sworn to send our men and women to defend, and implicitly enemies. And it's no surprise that if you're not in that club, that very expansive club of U.S. allies, you become suspect to the United States. And we see this in country after country. And so that's another way to describe what you've said, which is we have democratic allies and some non-democratic, although we have a lot of non-democratic folks in our alliances and our partnerships as well. So, I think that I would do basically the opposite of what you're seeing in the Trump administration with respect to take the NATO question. And in a way, I think Trump has just intensified what has been the policy of the United States, or the posture of the United States ever since NATO was created, which is to talk a lot about burden sharing, berate our allies, hey, step up. And then we give them no reason to do so, because at the end of the day, we decide that we're going to be forward deployed where they are, and we're going to defend them. And that benefits certain people in those countries, often the ruling elites. And, that makes sense to me. So I think we should do just the opposite. We should be polite. We shouldn't be nasty. but we should sit down and say, look, we have come to the realization that this is not in the United States' interests anymore, and that the United States cannot afford to do this kind of thing. And actually, if you look at our record, we have not contributed to the stability of the countries where we're most engaged in, the Middle East, for the past couple decades, and we are concerned that we could create a spiral of violence elsewhere as the 21st century goes on. And so let's work together and figure out could be a gradual transition, but a transition where the United States starts pulling troops out and sending them home. And I think we can do this in a responsible way, but it's not going to, you're absolutely right, it's not going to come from saying we're going to get complete agreement on everything first and subordinate what is in our own interest to the preferences of governments that benefit a lot from what the United States is doing.
Emma, some quick comments from you, then I'm going to open up to the floor.
Okay, yeah, so two quick comments. So I guess the first is really just to echo sort of the same point. I mean, forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing it, but it sounds like you are basically saying that there is nowhere where, if it is in the U.S. interest to step back, but it's not in, say, an ally's interest for the U.S. to do that, that there is nowhere that that is okay. You're saying allies effectively have a veto on whether U.S. troops are pulled back or not.
Well, no, I mean, I think it is in the U.S. interest to have the troops there, and I also think that, the Allies want the troops there. That's what I'm saying.
But should they have a veto as to whether the U.S. is there or not? Because the U.S. not be able to pull back?
Yeah, no, of
they
course.
accept-
I mean, the U.S. can pull back and basically, may end the alliance as a result. I mean, there's always fluctuations, I mean, there's fluctuations in U.S. troop levels in South Korea. That happens. That's sometimes contentious, but it's more response to sort of events in the region and basing sort of agreements and the like. So it's not that it's always static, but I think what we're talking about is a full-scale sort of disengagement or real reductions. I think that's...
Okay, yeah. So I think we disagree pretty strongly on that. The second point I would make is about costs, because I know a lot of people, particularly on the left of the political spectrum, make arguments about costs, that we could shift spending elsewhere if we weren't spending so much on conflict, and I really just don't think that's the argument that we should necessarily be making. I don't think that's the most important argument. I think this is about strategic costs. Perhaps it's opportunity costs. If we keep large troop deployments in Europe, what are we missing out on the opportunity to do? And so the Obama administration, for example, failed to do their pivot to Asia because they were so focused on the Middle East. And so I think there are larger strategic costs, opportunity costs that we are not considering when all we're focused on is just the dollars that are flowing into the defense budget.
The only thing I would add to all of this is that if we define our interests more narrowly, we're going to get one answer to the question of should we keep troops there. If we define them much more broadly, we're going to get a very different answer. And that's why I keep harping on, let's be clear on what we're talking about. I think I agree with Emma wholeheartedly, and I agree with you, Stephen, wholeheartedly, that the U.S. entanglements in the Middle East have very little to recommend them. Few redeeming qualities, which is a polite way of saying they've been basically a disaster. On the other hand, U.S. troop presence in Europe, there's no particular reason to conflate keeping troops somewhere long term with either conflict or with problems for the United States, right? That we could have troops somewhere indefinitely with large-scale benefits to the societies in which they are stationed and relatively few costs to us. So this is just another way of sort of saying, it may be cheaper to keep U.S. troops in Germany than it is to have them here in the United States. If that's okay with the Germans, if it's not causing problems, if it's not causing conflicts, maybe that's fine. Maybe that's a good thing. That I think we have to be very, very clear on, well, what are we using them for? What are the costs and benefits of that? And whenever we start getting into the kind of global, bring them all home, I get kind of worried.
Yeah, really quickly, I'm not saying bring them all home, but I am saying that, we need to set priorities. And, dividing the world up into allies and implicitly or explicitly enemies is not the way, for example, we're going to engage in the 21st century to rally the entire world to combat climate change, which is to me a bigger threat to the American people where they live and work and to us all than any geopolitical problem we have. And the problem I think that I have with just sort of stationing troops here or there, it might work out for a while in good times, and it might not be that expensive until it doesn't work out. And then we have committed ourselves in the most formal way to send our men and women into harm's way. Does that make sense? And if we are not able to have a conversation as a policy community to pull back at any point, and that's somehow seen as uncouth, oh, you're questioning, the alliances, then we are going to have a big problem when conditions in the world get worse than they are today.
All right, so we kind of run out of time, but I want to make sure I get 2 quick questions from the audience and some quick comments from the panel. Gentleman in the front row over here.
Yeah, thank you. George Liebman from the Calvert Institute in Baltimore. There's been an element of unreality, I think, about this discussion about wars, inasmuch as you haven't discussed at all 2 new forms of warfare that were, in many respects, initiated or legitimated by the United States, namely the cyber warfare exemplified by the Stuxnet episode in Iran, and more important, drone warfare practiced by us initially, I think, in Pakistan. Both of these were instituted without any serious effort at international regulation, unlike the situation with the Manhattan Project. And what we have now found, particularly with respect to drone warfare, is that it's a game that any number can play, as has been shown by the attack on a Saudi refinery, and also on our troops in Iraq. And to speak as though we now have carte blanche to put our troops all over the world without any serious threat of retaliation, when it's far from clear that there's any really good defense against drone warfare, it seems to me that you're missing the new elephant in the room, because I think we may very well have a changed situation in terms of our ability to deploy scattered forces in the Middle East or anywhere else. I'd like your response to that.
Thank you so much. The other gentleman in the same row.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mohammed Kayoum. I'm visiting here from California. My question is that time and time again, with these endless wars, what we've seen is that our allies and the people that we choose to make alliances with have either been sometimes directly against the U.S. or supported ideologies directly against what the U.S. is in favor of. And with the recent Soleimani killings, we learned not only that he helped in defeating ISIS, in Iran's role in defeating ISIS, but previously in defeating the Taliban in Afghanistan back in 2001. So my question is it time for the U.S. to really rethink its policy on Iran diplomatically, and are outside forces like Saudi Arabia and Israel holding us back from that?
So, who wants to take the first question?
That's an easy one, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think my guess is probably most of us would agree that the current administration's approach to Iran is dangerous, substantial risk of escalation, and needs to be seriously rethought. And unquestionably, there is a significant extent to which pressure from some of our allies in the region has led us to decisions that perhaps are not in either our interest or the region's best interest. On the other question, I think it's absolutely right that the emergence of the cyber domain and drone warfare, also coming soon, other forms of robotics and artificial intelligence-driven forms of warfare, all kinds of other nasty things we could talk about as well, profoundly change the way we need to think about risk and deterrence. There too, I'm not actually sure thinking of them as warfare is all that helpful, because I think thinking about cyber as primarily as warfare makes us want to import a whole bunch of assumptions and concepts about things like deterrence that may be wholly inapplicable when we talk about cyber. So I think you're entirely right that we need to be thinking very differently about the types of threats we face and the risks. Framing them as war, I suspect, adds more confusion than clarity to it.
Okay, yeah, so on the second question, not to go all Lord Palmerston on you, but America should have no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests, right? Oh, sorry, okay, I'm not going to bother repeating myself, though. But the point is that I think inertia has too often been a force in our foreign policy in recent years, and we are often very willing to continue with a friendship, an ally, a partnership, just because it's what we've always done. And I think we do need to step back sometimes and say, is that still in our interests? On the question about new forms of warfare, whatever you want to call them, I largely agree with Rosa, but I do think it should prompt us perhaps to think about how much we use the tools of American statecraft, the tools of American power, and how that's going to feel outside the unipolar moment. How are we going to feel when all the norms that we have violated on sovereignty, the use of drones, the use of other technologies, the use of sanctions, how are we going to feel when other countries turn around and start doing that to us when they have the capacity? And that day is coming fairly soon. And so I think overuse of these tools of power is something we really ought to be talking about a lot more.
Yeah, I guess I have a starkly different view maybe than Emma on this in terms of the permanent friends and enemies. I think it's true of the enemies that can change all the time. But I think the U.S. does have, if not permanent, semi-permanent friends and allies. I mean, I think democratic Germany, France, Australia, Japan, I mean, the list goes on, right, of the allies in East Asia and Europe. What's made those special is they're based on common values. They're extremely deep cooperative arrangements that have lasted for decades. And they're not transactional, and they're not contingent on feuds any given sort of year. And so I do think those to me are important. On the technology question, this is obviously a primary concern of the Pentagon, right? I mean, they're always concerned about technological innovation and what it means, and it raises big questions for the fleet, for instance, in Asia, in the Asia Pacific, in terms of, artificial intelligence, drones, hypersonics, all of these technologies that could threaten the presence. I do disagree, though, on one point, which is for a country to attack U.S. forces is an act of war, right? So deterrence is still in effect to some degree. You have to make sure that's credible, but it's not as if they can do that and just leave and then nothing happens, right? So there is still the fundamental dynamic at play. And then just finally on Stephen's point, I think there's two sets of risks here, and it just depends which one you choose, right? If you're in the retrencher position, I think you say, look, there were all of these commitments that if something really went wrong, we're in a nuclear war with Russia, and that's basically unacceptable. Even though that hasn't happened, it could happen. Like Article 5 is only invoked once on 9/11, right? So it hasn't happened, could happen, it's too high a risk for us, right? If you're me, or you're sort of, supportive of these alliances, what you would say is if you pull out and then there's interstate conflict that gets out of control, it's bad for America, period, but it also will drag the United States back in at a much greater cost, right, as it has in the past, right? Now, both of those are hypotheticals, right? We don't know which of those is the case, but I would argue that sort of 70 years of it not happening, like of deterrence being pretty stable, I think, in Europe, and a little less stable in Asia, but I think still pretty reliable, shows that it works. And I guess that will be the difference that we would have. But that's how I would try to, in a fair way. I think if you choose one, you come down on one side. If you choose another, you come down on the other side.
Yeah, and I appreciate you pointing out the risks of maintaining, in effect, primacy and a permanent commitment to alliances, because I think it's too seldom done, because we have a status quo bias. So we assume that, yes, we know what it looks like to continue doing what we're doing. But it sounds risky when we're talking about a big change, and I will agree that retrenchment would be a big change, and none of us knows exactly what the consequences would be. But I have to say that, if you look at the degree to which the U.S. foreign policy community and our broader politics, we're not in control on this stage, by the way, in case you've taken a look at American politics recently. We don't get to pull the levers to make a really nuanced policy. So there's so much threat inflation and fear-mongering, China, Russia, Iran, on down the line, that I think we have to ask serious questions about whether we, in Washington, D.C., the imperial capital, if you will, in a broader political context also that is deteriorating, know what the threats and interests are to certain regions better than the people in those regions themselves. In general, I think the answer is no. That doesn't mean we should leave overnight everywhere, but I think that is the baseline from which we should approach this problem, which is exactly the reverse of the baseline from which we usually have these kinds of discussions. So I'm grateful to you for inviting me to this forum. That's a joke because I work here also.
Well, these endless wars may not end as soon as I think many of us would wish, but this panel does have to end. So please join me in thanking the panel for an excellent conversation.